We have started this series since last year when, as if any of you have heard us talking right before this, international travel suddenly became impossible and we felt so disconnected and distant from everything else. This was a way to keep these connections alive as well as, understand different perspectives from some of the best in the field in different areas that we have managed to get people from. So today we are really, really lucky to have, you know, Andrew Rose, who is one of the prominent economists, and now he's the dean for NUS Business School. Let me introduce him very briefly. I'm sure all of you must have heard about him and looked up his profile, but nevertheless, Professor Andrew K. Rose is, as I mentioned, is the Dean for NUS Business School. He has received his PhD from MIT and MPhil from Nuffield College, Oxford, right? And BA from Trinity College, as well as Trinity College, University of Toronto. Dean Rose has published 150 papers and 30 articles in refereed economic journals. When I was at NUS about a decade back, and he would visit us, and I spent some amount of time with him. And what I admired was the discipline that he had in doing research. It's phenomenal. Andy, I don't know if I ever told you that, but truly, I really admired that. So no wonder that he has such impactful and phenomenal research, which has been published in all of the top journals that you can think of in economics, right? His research areas addresses issues in international trade, finance, macroeconomics, and he has been a wonderful teacher in international macroeconomics. Prior to joining NUS, Dean Rose served as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Chair for Faculty at Berkeley's Haas School of Business, and was the Managing Editor of the Journal of International Economics. He was the founding director of the Clausen Center for International Business and Policy at Haas and the Risk Management Institute at National University of Singapore. He has worked on 6 continents, and somewhere I've read he is a citizen of 3 countries. Andy, I did not know that part of it.
That's true.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so he has, of course, spent time in almost all parts of the world and has been part of different multinational agencies like International IMF, the World Bank, ADB, and so on and so forth, right? And I can go on, but I think that will do. And today, what we wanted to discuss with him, and he's going to give a short presentation before we get on to some discussion, is how should we think about business education now that we are looking at a lot of uncertainty, not only because of the pandemic, but a whole lot of other things that have already was in place, maybe from the technology point of view, the technological changes that we are thinking about and looking at, be it AI or other kinds of technological progress, societal as well as structural changes that we are seeing with a lot of emerging economies growing at rapid rate and so on, right? And somewhere, somehow, globalization has also been under threat, and all of that together has created a lot of uncertainty. And the question for us today is to think about how do we reform business education for the future, for the world that we would, step into, however normal that might be, right? I mean, however new normal or old normal that can be. So I'll stop at that, and I'll request Andy to take over and go ahead with his presentation.
Okay. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. It's good to reconnect with Partha. I will also say it's just a pleasure for me to be in, especially East Asia right now, because most areas of the world are not handling the pandemic particularly well. Not all of East Asia is handling it well, but all the countries that are handling it well are in East Asia. So I'm in Singapore right now, and that's going to color many of my remarks. Singapore has not had a perfect pandemic by any means. Initially, there wasn't essentially any mask wearing. So we know now that wearing masks is, of course, very important, but we didn't know back then. And there was this shortage of PPE equipment everywhere, certainly including Singapore. There was also a ex post preventable outbreak in the worker dormitories that certainly was preventable with hindsight. But the biggest disappointment for me right now is that the vaccine is rolling out very slowly in Singapore, as in most areas of the world, with a few exceptions like the United States, the UK, Israel, and a few others. But that's going to color many of my remarks, because if there's one thought that I'd like you to take away from the evening, it's that I believe that the post-pandemic world, certainly in business education, is going to look very similar to the pre-pandemic world with a vaccine. And the vaccine is going to be what saves us. And there have been some technological innovations, but I don't think that they're going to end up to be particularly important for a variety of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about. And in general, things are going to be moving very slowly. I do not expect there to be revolutionary changes in the way that university education and certainly business education are conducted in the future. There will be modest changes, but they'll be small. Okay, let me go into some of the most important reasons. I should also say that my thoughts here are to a large extent colored by the fact that I've been a dean in Singapore for the last 2 years, only my first 2 years as dean, although I was a dean for 6 years before in Berkeley. And one of the things that you have to know about all academic institutions, and in fact, in general, about most institutions, is that they move tremendously slowly. And even with serious disruption, especially in the not-for-profit sector, change moves at the pace of the individual institutions, which is typically very, very slow. So let me talk about some reasons why I believe that the pace of change will be slow. Here's one. If there's one thing that people who are working in higher education are always concerned about, it's rankings. International rankings are extremely important for any dean, any provost, any president, vice chancellor, and so forth. Because the institutions that do rankings, like the Financial Times or The Economist or Business Week or whatever you might imagine, and there are many, many institutions that do rankings. The very methodology of the rankings moves very slowly and depends only to a very small extent on things that can be affected by technology. So, for instance, somebody like me is extremely concerned about our Financial Times ranking, about our Times Higher Education ranking, and they rank many different programs. The methodology behind these rankings moves very slowly. Our students care about the rankings tremendously, so do our alumni. It is incumbent on anyone at an institution of higher education to preserve and enhance the value of a degree. And because rankings move slowly, the style of education moves slowly as a result. So that's one thing that's always in an administrator's mind. It moves slowly, so people like me adjust sluggishly. Here's a second thing that's always on people's minds: development, fundraising. Any university administrator is always concerned about fundraising. That's a key objective of a person like me, a dean, anyone who runs an institution of higher education, like a president, a vice chancellor, or anything like that. Fundraising is a key thing. The people who potentially give donations are concerned with things like rankings and visibility that move sluggishly. As a result, it's very difficult to reform an institution because in order to make an institution attractive to potential donors, the donors' preferences move slowly, so we move slowly. And fundraising is always at the top of mind. Okay, let me start to talk a little bit more about business schools in particular. And management education is very important to me. I've been at a business school for almost 40 years at this point, mostly at Berkeley, but some in Asia. And let me talk about my particular preferences and my style, and why in particular I think business schools are going to change almost not at all as a result of the pandemic. Okay, I'm an economist. I was trained as an economist. I've always done my research as an economist, and I try to act like I'm an academic economist. And in particular, the most important principle of international economics is that countries should do more of what they're good at and less of what they're poor at. And that's my guiding principle as an administrator. I believe that every research university, and I've always been at research universities, the National University of Singapore prides itself on being a serious research university. The objective of any research university is simple to describe in one sentence. It's to produce and disseminate research. Okay, now the most important function is production of research, and that's of course done by the academic staff. But it's also important that the same people engage in dissemination of research. Now, to a large extent, that's done by publishing scholarly articles in academic journals, by presenting them at conferences and seminars. But it's part of the dissemination of research occurs through the training of students, especially graduate students, but also undergraduates. Undergraduates in most fields of academic endeavor are learning material that is sometimes hundreds of years old, usually decades old at least. And that's certainly true at all business schools. My view is, as an administrator, my sole objective is to facilitate the production and dissemination of research. That fundamental objective hasn't changed, okay? And since I believe that most of the technological changes that have affected the world, certainly before the pandemic, such as the internet and so forth, but also the pandemic itself, haven't changed the objectives and haven't really changed very much the methods of either producing or disseminating research. Now, to some areas of research, this pandemic has been terrible. If you do work in the field, if you are working in a laboratory, and laboratories have often been shut down because of social distancing and de-densification and things like that, that's a big deal. But for many, many areas, and certainly almost all of the social sciences, the ability to produce and disseminate research has been affected almost not at all by the pandemic. And that's one of the reasons why in my particular area, economics, but more generally in business, the pandemic has actually been associated with an explosion of productivity because people find it easy to stay at home, and rather than be bored at home, they produce research. So most people's research productivity has risen in the last year or so, simply because the alternatives, the amount of leisure that one can consume enjoyably has fallen. Okay. Let me talk just a little bit more about the direct effects of the pandemic on management education. Now, I should say that I take teaching as an administrator, as the dean of a business school, very seriously. And at the National University of Singapore, our business school was essentially the only unit to teach hybrid in the fall semester. So we were only locked down just about a year ago, and Singapore had a relatively mild lockdown. We were locked down, it was called a circuit breaker here. It started only in the very last week of classes for the second semester in 2020. So our lockdown affected only the last week of classes and exams we'd already prepared to administer exams electronically. So we were barely affected in the last academic year. However, it became quickly apparent to us that with high probability, the pandemic was going to affect the 2020 to 2021 academic year. And so we prepared for that well in advance. It takes months to prepare. And we taught essentially all of our classes hybrid. And let me be a little bit more specific on what we meant by that. Hybrid for us meant teaching face-to-face to the maximal extent possible, okay? And in Singapore, the rule was you couldn't have more than 50 people in a room. So you could have a lecturer teaching no more than 49 students, everyone wearing masks or face shields, socially distanced and so forth. Okay, so we did the maximal amount of face-to-face teaching, but we also combined it with simultaneously teaching to Zoom. Okay, so simultaneously, the same lecturer was teaching synchronously to anyone who couldn't make it into the classroom, either because they were overseas or because they're in the country but couldn't make it into the classroom, as well as face-to-face. And of course, simultaneously, everything was recorded so that students could watch things asynchronously. Okay, so that takes a lot of training because it's very difficult for instructors to monitor the chat and to monitor students who are appearing only online, as well as those face-to-face. Working out the audio-visual things took us months, but we were prepared to do it. In fact, we were the only unit to do full hybrid teaching in the first semester. Since then, everyone, certainly at the National University, has followed us. Okay, why was hybrid so important to me? Okay, well, I think about this from a purely economic point of view. What is the purpose of providing business education? So far as I can see, there are three purposes. The reasons why students go to a school of management or business, there are only three. The first and most important one has nothing to do with anything that they learn. It's an idea that's, it's an old idea in economics. It's called the signaling idea. It's associated with a famous Canadian economist named Mike Spence. He actually won the Nobel Prize for it around 20 years ago. And the idea of signaling is that if you have a particular person who is actually a very high caliber person, very capable individual, but who can't communicate that effectively to a potential employer, what they have to do is provide a signal that the employer can see that is costly for the person, the potential employee, to send. And the most natural signal to send is getting into a good business school and getting through the business education with a good degree. Okay, so the most important reason why I think that most students actually want to go to business school is because they're signaling to future employers that they're high quality individuals who are willing to spend a couple of years working hard, learning stuff, excelling in the classroom. And if you take that argument seriously, and certainly I do, Spence won the Nobel Prize for it, and for what it's worth, Spence was the dean of Stanford Business School, one of the world's very best business schools. If you take that argument seriously, which I and most economists do, it's really important not to dilute the value of the degree in any way, so that the signal that students are sending to future employers is never diluted. Okay, so you have to take that seriously. You cannot expand membership in the school to a large number of people. You don't want the school to be scalable. Stanford Business School could, in principle, quadruple its size very easily. They don't, because they don't want to dilute the value of the signal. Same thing with Harvard or Chicago or any really good business school. So it's important not to dilute the value of the signal, which means you have to provide a high quality education that's difficult to get through, which means you have to provide face-to-face teaching in small numbers only to the interested students. So the first and most important reason for students to go to business schools that one has to respect is signaling. Probably the second most important reason why students go to business school is because they're interested in joining a network, okay? And they want to meet people, they want to join the network. That's the reason why they go to the best possible school of management or business school, because those are associated with the best quality networks. The networks are very important for getting a job and for moving between industries and firms and sectors. If you want to engage in networking, it has to be done face-to-face. Almost no quality networking can be done via Zoom. If you meet somebody anonymously via LinkedIn or Zoom or whatever, you don't have any real connection with a person. So in order to preserve the value of a network, you need face-to-face teaching. We need hybrid. Okay, so one of the most striking things is you will notice that of the two most important reasons for students to go to business school, one of the two most important reasons for business education, neither of them has anything to do with what is actually taught by the instructors. And I freely admit that. Okay, the third most important reason for students to go to business school is any learning that they actually do, whatever they actually learn in business school. Because of course we work very hard to try and add value to our students. But there are two important types of learning: inside the classroom and outside the classroom. Now, students learn definitely much, much better inside the classroom for reasons that I don't think are very clearly understood. In principle, students can go and take video courses at the Khan Academy for free. They can take Coursera or Udacity courses. These have been freely available or inexpensively available for decades, but they don't really seem to result in much learning. Even before the internet existed, it was always possible, at least in principle, to sign out textbooks from the library, to study textbooks. You don't need a library, you don't need a lecturer, you don't need an instructor, you can just go read a book. But in practice, that doesn't seem to result in much learning. Inside the classroom, people tend to learn more, especially if they're challenged by exams at the end. So inside the classroom, learning is done much more effectively face-to-face than Zoom. And if anyone doubts that, you might have heard of these enormous protests all over the world where students who are forced to take all of their courses via Zoom ask for rebates. And they ask for rebates because their view is that the quality of the educational experience is much compromised by a purely online experience. They would therefore owed a refund or a rebate or whatever. And that's just a reflection of the fact that you learn much more inside the classroom. But part of the learning takes place inside the classroom. A critical part of learning takes place outside the classroom. The students meet with each other, they do group projects, they bump into each other, they engage in all sorts of interactions, and these are also a critical part of learning, especially for second and third degrees. And that also needs face-to-face contact, because those interactions, those group projects, those presentations, all that interaction takes place only because students have to go to a class face-to-face, and then they meet afterwards and eat together or have a sit down and study together or whatever. So it's very important, as far as I'm concerned, to engage in face-to-face teaching at the tertiary education level. Now, of course, it's far more important for primary school students to meet together, because a lot of the learning that they're doing is through social interactions, where you have kids that are 6 years old, 8 years old, 10 years old, that are trying to figure out how to interact with each other, and they can only do that face-to-face. So for all these reasons, it strikes me that face-to-face education is extremely important. Zoom has made a huge impact on the world as a result of the pandemic. I personally think Zoom it's way better than the previous technologies, and it's not close to what it's going to be in 5 or 10 years. Most people don't have very good internet connections. As 5G takes over, the quality of our interactions is probably going to increase dramatically. But for a host of reasons, the technology right now is not very impressive. And there are so many reasons to engage in face-to-face teaching that I think, even though the pandemic has given an enormous boon and has accelerated any shift over to purely online, it's accelerated that shift. But as soon as the vaccine is rolled out in any to any substantial degree, I believe everyone is going to want to go back to as many face-to-face interactions as possible. Okay, why don't I can go over much more stuff about business education, but that's the fundamental reason why I just don't think things are going to change very much as a result of the pandemic. I think the technology is not there, and the fundamental reasons for education, especially at a business school, dictate that we engage in face-to-face education. Why don't I pause and see if there are any questions that emerge at this point? I can go on, of course, at length, but let me stop now.
Sure, thanks. No, I think, there are some very important points that you made, and not only business education, but overall in education, I think this interaction between people at the same location, that's kind of important. And we would probably see much of normalcy, getting when we are out of this pandemic, and somehow the normalcy will again look like where people are actually interacting face to face. But, one thing that we have to think about, and I'll come back to something else, but is, can we use this technology to, so of course, you made the point that, business schools, as well as, whatever you call them, like the top schools of different kinds, they want to be exclusive, right? I mean, that's part of the signaling thing. But one of the other aspects is to, particularly in a region like Asia, like Southeast Asia, South Asia, where there is a mass of population, right? So do you think there is a role of technology to spread education in a meaningful way?
Sure, absolutely. But until, I mean, the internet makes education much easier to disseminate, and that's got to be a fundamentally good thing. Okay, so there's no doubt that having access to the resources of the world through the internet can only improve educational opportunities. There's no doubt about that. But if you think about the skills that potential employers want to be able to see, they want to make sure that a kid can read and write and compose an essay, do a math problem. At this point, it's still very difficult for a potential employer or a potential school that's considering hiring promoting a student, if you're trying to figure out whether to take an elementary school graduate into a prestigious secondary school, or to give a scholarship or an award, the institution that is considering making the decision has to be able to verify inexpensively, but completely credibly, that the person who's actually submitting their credentials was the one who actually did the work. And that's a very difficult problem. And the ease of fraud is also falling, of course, with the cost of communication. Many people don't trust the internet, and many of us, of course, don't click on what are obviously fake phishing links in our email. And the difficulties associated with certification remain very, very serious. At some point, I feel confident that those problems will be fixed, but we're not there at this point. So a kid can learn, a kid in a remote island of Indonesia, or in some obscure village in India, or in the middle of the jungle in Cambodia or Brazil, they may well be able to teach themselves to read. And that's a great thing. But will they be able to convince someone else that they know how to read without doing it right in front of the potential employer or the potential institution of higher learning, that is a much more difficult problem at this point.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with you on that, I don't think there is much substitute for this face-to-face, as you said, both because of in-class learning, but as well as out-of-class learning, right? Now, the three things that you mentioned that why somebody would go for business education, the first two, in some sense, us as educators have nothing much to do with, right? Both the signaling aspect with it as well as networking. So let's talk about the third aspect. And one thing that we did not really talk about so far is the content part of it. That, I mean, as we said, that there's been a lot of information overload and availability that has happened through internet, etc. So that has changed how people learn in a different context, that where information is not necessarily the main thrust of education, which was probably probably the case maybe a couple of decades back, right? But also the question therefore becomes is, do we target skills more in a business school setting, or do we think about a much more, like a social sciences education, much more critical thinking, critically examining things, and decision making to a certain extent?
Well, I'm very much on the side of trying to teach the basics and essentials and the more abstract concepts rather than directly applicable skills. So for instance, when it comes to computer science, you don't really care about whether you learn Python or R or whatever the exact computer language is. You want to be able to know that the students know how to design programs and what the essence, the methodology is. Or if you're teaching something in finance, it's more important to make sure that the students understand the basics of, for instance, present value, which is a very simple concept to some extent, but it's a very, very powerful and sophisticated concept to much of the world, rather than the particular way that you price an individual option, or that you engage in a certain type of fintech right now. So I think the education that lasts is going to be one that ensures that the graduates know not just the material that they've been taught, but they know how to learn in the future, okay? Because the one thing that you're sure of is that anyone who graduates in the next few years is not going to be doing the same thing in 15 years that they do when they graduate. There's going to be continued technological development. So the most important thing is not to learn the minutia of what is current, what is important currently right now. It's that they know how to learn in for the future. So the basics, and that's one of the reasons why I'm a strong believer in teaching theoretical stuff, so that people have principles as opposed to just the applications.
Right. The other thing that I think maybe we can talk about for a bit is now, particularly in Asia and India too, we see a lot of people interested in startups rather than getting jobs in more established firms and so on and so forth. So do we need to adapt our business education in particular to gear towards that? Do we need to do something differently? Because most of the business education to begin with was to think about corporates a lot more, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
I guess my view is, I don't know if the interest in startups is either enormously different from what it's been historically, because of course, historically, there have been a huge number of small firms that have that have started up, and that's always been true. And of course, don't forget also that most startups fail, okay? You hear about the more successful ones, but the vast majority of small firms fail or stay small forever. Nevertheless, I certainly agree with you that they're viewed as much sexier now than they were, say, a decade ago. And that's twinning with another trend, which is there's a growing demand for higher education just in general across the world. When I was graduating myself, a first degree, a bachelor's degree in Canada was viewed as probably a ticket to the middle class. When my parents were graduating, a bachelor's degree was, you were guaranteed entry into the upper middle class. Most people, of course, graduated back then with only high school diplomas, and that was viewed as the ticket to the middle class. As time goes on, all over the world, there's a growing demand for higher education. And I think very soon it's going to be almost the necessary credential to have not just a bachelor's degree, but a master's degree. And you've seen that this has been true in Europe for a while. It's increasingly true in East Asia and in the Americas. And the most popular and fastest growing segment of the population is the pre-experienced masters. So the easy way to think about it is, suppose you're a parent of a kid and your kid graduates with a degree in Chinese calligraphy or anthropology or theoretical physics or something like that, that they've enjoyed doing, but has no potential for any serious employment. What does the parent do? The parent says to the kid, stay in school for an extra year, get a pre-experienced master's in, say, management. And that's where there's been tremendous growth. The pre-experience, so not an MBA, and it's before you enter the labor force. And those master's programs, they're often 18 months long, either 1 year or 18 months. They're sort of like a little MBA for students who don't have any work experience and who are slightly more immature, and they're somewhat diluted in value, but they give you a little bit of everything. And those are the degrees that are extremely popular for people who want to run startups, because they give you a little bit of accounting, a little bit of finance, they give you a little bit of organizational behavior, so you know something about human resource allocation, they give you a little bit of economics, a little bit of strategy, et cetera, et cetera. So I see the real growth in business education at the pre-experienced master's level, and that is probably in part because that's the segment of the educational space that helps startups grow much more dramatically. So I think business education is adapting endogenously to the growth in the startup culture.
All right, I think there's one question so far, and we can take more questions for sure. So it says that if businesses run on the capability to understand people and execute bridges between them, then to what extent does business education play a role for someone starting a business? I guess, or I think we kind of preempted a little bit of that in this question. So,
yeah, I'm not sure that business is really about building bridges between people. I mean, most businesses that are going to be successful figure out some product that consumers or other businesses need that they can produce, or produce in a more efficient or more interesting or more innovative or more inexpensive format. And you know, in order to start a business, you need a multitude of skills. You're only going to learn a tiny fraction of those from school, but you probably want to learn a little bit about many, many things, which is what a master's in management is all about.
Since there are no questions from the audience yet, I'll let them write more questions. But let me go back to one thing that you mentioned at the very beginning, ranking. How do we, I mean, so clearly that is something that has to be dealt with, right? I mean, I don't think I've met anyone who's really happy with any ranking that comes out, right?
Yep.
Go about reforming that, because clearly, you know, all that we do in universities, business education for sure, but overall in the university is so much dependent on how the rankings are organized, right? So
I don't think that there's any plausible way to reform the ranking system. It just can't be done, because first of all, there are many, many different rankings, and they all have an incentive to differentiate one from another. So the Times Higher Education system prides itself on being very different from The Economist, which prides itself on being very different from the Financial Times, et cetera, et cetera. There's no reason why they would all agree on a constant formula. And of course, their argument is, and it's a legitimate argument, that different rankings from different institutions are measuring different things, which I think is perfectly right. And that's the reason why you don't necessarily care that much about any single ranking. Now, I should also say, you cannot ignore rankings as far as I'm concerned. They're very important, but it's also a mistake to spend very much attention focused on any single ranking, because there's lots of randomness associated with these individual rankings. They move from year to year because, of course, each of these magazines or publications has to sell issues every year. And even if the rankings move sluggishly, they always rearrange the methodology or put in new data or whatever it is, so that there's always some movement. And for those of you who aren't aware, rankings are also a scam to some extent, because any institution that sells rankings, okay, is also delighted to sell consulting services to institutions of higher learning to teach you how to manipulate the rankings to your own benefit. So it's a scam. There's nothing to be done about it. They're always going to be with us.
That's a little bit gloomy, but I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Well, it's the same sort of thing that we have all sorts of credit rating agencies, right? And there's Standard & Poor's, and there's Fitch, and there's Moody's, and they're happy to make money off selling those ratings, but and you can't say you should all use the same ratings, because each one says we do it in a slightly different way. They serve a purpose. There's a downside. You can't ignore them. That's just the reality of the world.
All right, I'll get on to some questions, and looks like these are from students. Somebody is asking that at what point in one's career should we ideally go for an MBA?
At what point should you go for
an MBA? I suppose, to give you the context, in India, a large number of students go to MBA without experience, right?
Okay. My personal view is you want to get an MBA when you actually know what you're after from the MBA. And that typically means having both graduated from your, finishing off your undergraduate degree and getting, I would say, at least 3, but between 3 and 5 years worth of work experience. So you have a better sense of the sort of job that you're interested in. But the perfect time for an MBA is where you've hit a point at your firm or in your industry or in your occupation where you want something different and you don't know how to do it within the firm or industry or occupation. So an MBA is the perfect way to switch industries or sectors or firms or occupation, because most MBAs require an internship in the summer in between, and that's the perfect opportunity to switch yourself. So you have to know enough about yourself to know what you want and also what you don't want. So my view is the perfect time is after working between 3 to 5 years, but more particularly after you know what you want to do differently, and choose an institution to get your MBA which allows you to switch industries or occupation or sector or firm or whatever it is that you're interested in.
All right. So now I think there are a couple of questions about starting businesses and how do they go about, and what's your suggestion? I suppose within the MBA program, do they do something different from a regular student, or how do they go about?
If you want to start a startup while you're in business school.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, first of all, you want to be sure that you choose a business school that's going to enable you to do what it is that you want to do. So for instance, If you're interested in something in a startup in food and beverages, choose the school appropriately. If you want to choose something that is focused on a particular firm, then make sure that you go to a business school where the firm hires a lot of students from. If you want to work in, say, the tech sector and you want to engage in a startup there, make sure that you choose a business school that's known for siring startups, that has connections to incubators in that sector, okay? So the critical thing is to make sure that you've chosen your school appropriately, and that should be clear as day. When you apply to a business school and after you're admitted, there are typically all sorts of functions that occur where they're trying to induce you to actually accept the offer. And one of the things that you should always ask about is, what is the student life like? What is the club life like in this sector for startups? If it's a tech startup, or if it's in food and beverage, or if it's in transportation, or whatever it is that you have an idea in. Choose a school that already has a reputation for producing people in that area, because that's where you're going to meet like-minded people. And the one thing that every startup entrepreneur says is they want to bump into lots of like-minded people doing basically the same sort of thing.
Next question, I'll just read that out. It says that since pandemic has played out a role in changing the environment and process of learning for more and more graduates and undergraduates, what, according to you, should we focus on more consciously so as to stand at par with the requirements of employers and educators that hire us in future in business education? So go ahead. I think it's about getting into business education as a career later on.
Well, I will say that the most important reasons for going to business school have to do with credentials, and you want the best credentials. So you want to get into the best possible business school that you can get into if your objective is just to get a job. And if you have any doubt about what the best quality business school, if you've got into more than one, or if you don't know where to apply, focus on the network, focus on the graduates, especially the most recent graduates, and what they're doing now. One of the standard horizons is most business schools focus on what their graduates from 5 years ago are doing now. And you should find it possible to go to events where relatively recent graduates are hanging out, okay, the alumni are hanging out, because it's very much in their interest to ensure that the value of their degree is preserved. And that's how you figure out in practice if the business school is going to be valuable for you in a particular sector or industry or whatever. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. So far we have been talking mostly about MBA and graduate programs and so on. I think this question is about undergraduate business education to a certain extent. There's a couple of questions actually, which asks that, is it better to do a degree in something else like technology and then go into management education or business education? Or is it worth going into business education like a BBA program or a BMS program as we call it here, and continue to do an MBA later on?
Well, I think if you're interested is primarily, for instance, in the tech sector, then what you should do is get your first degree in computer science or tech or physics or chemistry or biology or whatever it is, because the business education will only take a year or two afterwards. And you want to get the basic science or the basic skills associated with your primary interest first. If you don't know exactly what you're interested in, and all you know is that you want to, you're interested in business, then fine, go for a BBA. But I do believe that it's very difficult at the age of, say, 16 or 17 to say, I want to go into business. I also think it's not a good idea for most students to take a BBA without at least a year or two of more a broader reading, because you'll never get a chance to read, like take a course in Russian literature, take a course in art history, learn some ancient history, take a physics course. You'll never ever get an opportunity later on in your life to figure out if you're good in social sciences or pure sciences or one of the humanities. And I, in general, think that too many people take undergraduate degrees in business when they should be exploring something deeper that's more fundamental and closer to their potential interests. So I discourage students from aspiring to take an undergraduate degree in business. At Berkeley, for instance, we forced all undergraduates to take 2 years of general studies, and then they applied to transfer into the Haas School. And that only covered the last 2 years of their undergraduate degree. I think that's a much healthier thing for the individual.
Interestingly, at Shivananda University, we actually require all students, including undergraduate business students, to do a lot of courses outside the business school. So
that's good.
It's not a 2-year thing that Berkeley has, but it allows people to get this broader perspective that you talked about. So
yeah, it's a very healthy thing for the individual. It's your opportunity to expand your horizons.
All right. Now I think people are getting into more specific things. Somebody says, I'm a BTech student graduating in 2023 and want to move into fields of finance and financial markets in US, okay? Should I target an MBA in finance or STEM courses like masters in financial engineering?
Well, if you're very good in mathematics and physics and you can do heavy duty, if you can do continuous time stochastic calculus pretty easily, the more technical it is, the better. But of course, more technical skills get you a higher premium, but they do pigeonhole you. You're going to find it difficult to move away from things. But right now, of course, the more quantitative you are, the more employable you are, the more attractive you are to employers.
All right. Thanks so much. I don't think we have any other questions.
Okay.
Now, I think it was a very enjoyable conversation. And again, appreciate you taking the time off and talking about these things. And I'm sure the audience here had a great time and also got a great deep insight into some of these issues that we talked about.
Thank you.
To all people here, thank you being with us. I know it's particularly in India right now, lots going on. I know people are here from different parts of the world, and I hope all of you, wherever you are, you stay safe and get out of this pandemic in a good shape, so to say, right?